Good morning, students. We're going to look at our second focus question of the week, which is, why did the 1850s mark the decisive turning point, the decade that leads to the Civil War of 1861-65? What happened in those 10 years? Okay, so I just want to remind you that we saw earlier this week, we looked at the earlier origins of the Civil War, the origins, the causes that stretch back way before 1850. Right? And we saw that it really was the westward expansionism of the United States that leads to the tensions that lead to the Civil War. Every time the United States grew in size, expanding in those three major waves we've talked about, 1803, Louisiana Purchase, 1845, statehood of Texas, and then spectacularly so, 1848, with the acquisition of the vast Mexican cession. Every time the United States expanded, the question of whether slavery would also expand in Western territories arose and was magnified. So we saw how the Missouri Compromise of 1820, then the Compromise of 1850, were attempts to manage the tensions between Northerners and Southerners over the expansion of slavery into these new territories. But also how each compromise, 1820, 1850, was not perfect. And now we saw that especially the acquisition of Mexican territory in 1848 really increased tensions, and it led to that compromise of 1850, the terms of which we examined earlier. And we concluded also, though, that compromise of 1850 it temporarily calmed things down, but it also planted the seeds for further tensions. For example, one of the stipulations, one of the outcomes of that compromise of 1850 was the fugitive law, which allowed Southerners to force Northerners to return to them slaves that had escaped to the North using the Underground Railroad, for example, forcing Northerners to return slaves to the South. And this fugitive law, part of the Compromise 1850, really angered the Northerners and increases, these tensions that are now really starting to accelerate between the Southern slave states and the Northern free states. However, it's the decade of the 1850s that really include the turning points that lead to the Civil War of 1861. So the most important ones are listed here. First, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act determines that future states will be carved out of the Kansas and Nebraska territory. Now, that in and of itself does not cause tensions. The idea that states should be carved out of territories is a principle that's been applied for a long time, will continue to be applied. But the problem here is that the Kansas-Nebraska Act says that whether or not the states to emerge out of the Nebraska territory or the Kansas territory will have slaves or not is now an open question. An open question which will be decided by vote in a process of popular sovereignty when the time comes to decide to create states out of these territories. And this truly angers the North because, in effect, and the North is right about this, by saying that slavery can exist north of the 3620 latitude line that had been established by the Compromise of 1820, in effect, what's happening is that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the terms of the Compromise of 1820 are being abolished. Remember, the Compromise of 1820 had said no slaves north of this line here. Okay? So this is a major blow to compromise, really, between North and South, and leads to growing tensions. And it'll lead directly, actually, in 1855, to an episode in American history known as Bleeding Kansas, in which, in 1855, let me find my text here, sorry. It's an episode in which Northerners and Southerners confront one another violently in Kansas as that future state gets ready to vote on whether it would be a free or slave state. So you actually have violence happening now in 1855, actual killings between Northern and Southerners. Not the Civil War yet, but it's a sign of things to come. Next, you have in 1856, you have the creation of a new party, the Republican Party. This is actually our current Republican Party. And the reason this will lead to civil war is that this is the first party ever in American history to be anti-slavery, to be dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery in the West. Okay, so what this means is that this will in the future be an exclusively Northern party or a free state party, meaning also a party that's prevalent in California. Nobody in the South will vote for the Republican Party in the next presidential elections of 1860. That is also a very dramatic development, which will lead to the division of the United States into Republicans in the North and the Democratic Party in the South. Okay? Now, then you have another turning point in 1857 with the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision. And what this Supreme Court decision basically entails is the declaration that former slaves and slaves are not U.S. citizens and have therefore no human rights, no civil rights. This enrages Northerners who consider that now the South is trying to impose their way of life on them through the Supreme Court by stripping, taking away the human and civil rights of people of color, including free people of color who live in the North. Okay, so this is very grave and will lead to civil war. Now, I want to back up here and conclude with this slide. I want to point out that throughout the 1850s, really, you have mounting cultural and political confrontations between Northerners and Southerners that express themselves in various ways, through books, as you'll see tomorrow, but also through violence. We saw in Bleeding Kansas when Northern Southerners actually go at each other, kill each other over whether Kansas will be a free state or a slave state. And then you also have violence even in Congress. Famously, for example, on May 21, 1856, a Southern House representative, a slave owner, Preston Brooks, beat unconscious a Northern senator because the Northern senator had harshly criticized slavery. And Preston Brooks, the Southerner, considered that he had been insulted personally and therefore proceeded to, in effect, almost kill Charles Sumner. All right, so we are really on the verge of conflict in the 1850s, and that will come, as we'll see, with the election of 1860, which we'll talk about soon.